Chapter 2, Principles of Occurrence. To start the chapter, we talk about the foundations of epidemiology, what exactly epidemiology is and why it is necessary within public health and within infectious diseases, as well as chronic diseases, to have an understanding of why we need epidemiologists. Epidemiologists seek to discover the cause of a disease, establish patterns of the disease, and recommend measures so that diseases can be prevented, controlled, and or eliminated. So basically what we're saying here is that epidemiologists and public health officials, what they do is they follow diseases. So if we want to talk about something so basic as the flu that affects us every year, we want to see the patterns of how that disease occurs, the areas that it's most significant in, and then what they're going to do is recommend measures so that the disease can be prevented. Once again, if we talk about the flu, how are we going to prevent the flu outbreaks? How are we going to control flu outbreaks and or basically eliminate the flu? And so the first thing that would come to my mind, and I'm sure to all of your minds as healthcare providers, would be to be vaccinated against the flu. So here we can prevent the outbreak of it. If we do have an outbreak of it, it can be controlled by the fact that the majority of people or healthcare workers have the flu vaccine. And also that basically it can be eliminated in some areas. So many years ago, well, not really that many years ago, a few years back, I did my last clinical dental hygiene job that I had was in one of the state penitentiaries that is in this area, Trumbull County Correctional Institute. And we basically shut down all services in the prison for 2 days and inoculated everybody against the flu, because you have to figure if one or two people get the flu from a visitor, then chances are that their cellie or their cellmate's going to get it, and that's going to continue to be passed around, and before you know it, the majority of the prison's going to have, the prisoners are going to have the flu. So we did that with vaccinations as well as TB tests. So once a year, they shut everything down. Everyone got the TB tests the next day or the 2 days later, whatever the time frame was. We went back through and checked to make sure that no one had a positive response to tuberculosis, because you can imagine what that would be like in a closed environment like the prison. Some important terms that are necessary for discussing or understanding public health begins with endemic. And endemic refers to the constant presence of a disease in a population. The example that the book uses is heart disease, and we all know heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States. So there would be a constant presence of that disease within a population in different areas and different communities. The other term that you need to know is epidemic, and I know a lot of people have heard this term, and that's an outbreak of one specific disease in excess than normally expected. So that would be, going back to talking about the flu, that would be if, say, the flu vaccine had been administered And although it might be influenza B and influenza A that the flu vaccine is going to prevent, there may be another virus that is circulating as a flu that was not part of, say, that particular year's flu vaccination. And so people start getting sick with it. And, you know, even going back to the prison, if everyone or the majority of people in the prison get that particular strain of the flu, then it's an epidemic, it's an outbreak. And the other term that we need to know is pandemic, which is basically an epidemic that is widespread over a particular country, continent, or the world. And the book uses AIDS as a pandemic. And although I don't know that right now I would say that AIDS is an epidemic, I think that we could go back to the Zika virus when it started in Africa and people were traveling to Africa and crossing continents and bringing that Zika virus to um, the country that they were from. And so it is very difficult if there is an infectious disease to prevent it from crossing continents, especially with the fact that we have air travel the way we have right now. So people can pick things up and bring them to other countries and start their own epidemics in those particular countries. Another term that is necessary is prevalence, and that's the number of cases of a particular disease in a community at a specified time. So that would be how often basically that particular disease is occurring within a time frame. And another one is incidence. And incidence is the number of new cases occurring during a specific time. So when people use the word incidence, a lot of times they don't use it correctly. It is new cases that are occurring. So epidemiologists like to observe the different rates, how often or how frequently incidence or prevalence of diseases are occurring. So if you turn to page 26 in your book, you will see the rates of disease occurrence described. And in order to measure how prevalent a disease is, what you're going to do is take the number of cases of that particular disease present in the population at a specific time, and you divide it by the number of persons in that population at that particular time. And then it's multiplied by 1,000. So if you look at your example on page 26, it gives the example in a college with 2,569 students, 18 missed classes on October 1st because of the flu or influenza. These students did not all become ill at the same time, but all were ill on that day in question. So how it's broken down is you had 18 existing cases. Okay, so that would be the number of cases in that population divided by 2,569 students in the school altogether. Okay, and if you divide that out, that's going to equal 0.0070, and then you multiply that by 1,000, and the answer is 7. So the prevalence rate for influenza at that particular college on October 1st was 7 per 1,000 students. So you might want to review that just a couple times to have an understanding of how that actually, how that calculation actually works. It's pretty easy, but you might want to just review it another time. And refer back to your book again. The example on page 27 is going to show you how to measure the rates of occurrence of incidents. So that would be the number of new cases, because we know that's what an incidence is, in a specific time, divided by the population at risk for the disease, times 1,000. So in the book, the example is if we return to the same college and find that 8 of the flu cases actually began on October 1st, then that basically would be your incidence. So the incidence for October 1st would be 3 per 1,000 students. Okay, so 8 new cases divided by the 2,569 students at the college is equal to 0.003, and then you multiply that times 1,000, and that's going to give you 3. So that would be the incident occurrence within that particular group. 3 per 1,000 students had new cases. And once again, that example's on page 27. You might want to go back over again and just review to make sure you have an understanding of how, what is divided into the population at risk in order to get your answer. Or have a better understanding, I should say. So some areas that if you're going to be doing any studies or you're going to be writing a literature review and you need to back up whatever you're talking about with data and prevalence and incidence of particular diseases, here's some areas that you might want to look at. You can go to the U.S. Census Bureau. You can go to the National Vital Statistics reports. There's also a really good newsletter that's put out, I want to say it's weekly or bi-weekly. It's called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. And another area is the publications of the National Health Service. All of those will give you some really good data on different prevalence and incidence of occurrence of particular diseases. Some other terms that are important for you to understand would be the different levels of prevention. And we know that the United States has really tried to push for prevention of disease versus treating the disease once it's already started. And I will tell you, if you're not familiar with Healthy People 2020, you might want to look that up. That's from the U.S. government. It's called Healthy People 2020. And what Healthy People does is it sets goals based on different diseases that are a problem within the United States. And with those goals, it sets objectives to support the goals. So based on whatever the disease is, they may say something like, we want to reduce the number of incidents of asthma. So that would be new cases of asthma. And then that would be the goal. And then those objectives would be maybe very specific for children between the ages of 6 to 8 to reduce the incidence of asthma from, and I'm just throwing numbers out there right now, from say 1,000 in a year's time to maybe 800. So that's how the goals would support, or I'm sorry, that's how the objectives would support the goals. So you might want to look that up. I'm not going to require it, but it can be very helpful for future coursework that you do when you're looking at different problems within the United States, health problems. There's all kinds of objectives. There's reduce suicide, there's motor vehicle accidents, heart disease. So there's all different levels. When I taught dental public health and preventive public health a few years back, I always made the students do complete a paper on one of the goals, and given to have an understanding of each goal and what the United States is looking at. And we know if we can prevent diseases, then we're going to reduce the overall cost of health care in the United States, which is another goal that we kind of look at. But getting back to the levels of prevention, primary prevention measures that are taken before the disease occurs to reduce the susceptibility. So the number one example that I can give for that are vaccinations. So what we want to do when we give a vaccination, just talking about the flu a little bit ago, we want to vaccinate it before the disease occurs. And the other one that I threw in there are dental sealants. If you are or you're not familiar with dental sealants, it's a preventative measure where they put a thin coating of almost plastic flowable material over the grooves of children's first and second molars when they're most susceptible for caries or decay, to prevent getting decay in those teeth. So if they put this coating over top of it, nothing gets stuck in those little pits and fissures of the teeth to cause decay, so they prevent decay. Secondary prevention, and going back to primary prevention in dentistry, since my original background was in dentistry, another primary prevention that is huge in the United States especially, but worldwide, is community fluoridation. So if we add fluoride to our community water, we are going to prevent the susceptibility of decay overall, but decay in between teeth, which is what community fluoridation prevents. It doesn't necessarily prevent decay on the top of the teeth. That's where the sealants are used, but the fluoride is absorbed in the child's system when drinking the water while the teeth are developing to make them stronger to prevent decay in between the teeth. So that's a huge area of primary prevention as well. Secondary prevention, I apologize if you heard my German Shepherd puppy in the background. Secondary prevention, that is measures that are taken to diagnose a disease that's already present. So it doesn't necessarily mean it is a disease that is life-threatening at that point in time, but it means that the disease has begun, and now we're going to diagnose this disease and hopefully begin very minimal treatment of the disease. So that is pap smear. When a female gets a pap smear to see if there's abnormal cells, and another one would be a mammogram. A mammogram is only going to show something if there's something there. So that's why we really don't call it a measure of primary prevention, because it does not prevent the individual from getting the disease. Just like a pap test does not prevent someone from getting cervical cancer, but it will diagnose it hopefully at an early stage, so the treatment and the overall patient outcome could be minimal, and that the individual would be able to still live a healthy, happy life. And then the last level of prevention is called tertiary, and it involves all the steps taken to return the individual to a normal state of health or to keep that individual alive. And the book uses physical therapy for polio victims. So they already have the disease, but now we're going to try and make that individual have a better quality of life. And it's the same with an individual that has cancer. We're going to treat that cancer and hopefully improve the state of health of the patient and keep the patient alive. And in the dental field, though, the one thing that we would always use, or I would always use as an example for tertiary, would be root canal therapy for a carious tooth or a tooth that has extensive decay. Instead of having the tooth removed, we would save the tooth by doing a root canal on the tooth. So that would be a level of tertiary in dentistry. So next we're going to look at different disease agents, things that actually cause diseases in individuals. And we're going to start off with viruses. And a virus is the smallest disease-causing agent. Remember that a virus must have a host to live. It cannot live by itself like a bacteria can. So if you have a virus, using the example of HIV, people were always so afraid of getting HIV from a dental office. But the thing about HIV is it has to live. It has to have a host, so it has to live in a human, within the cells of a human. It's not going to live on a solid surface. I think, if I'm not mistaken, HIV actually can only live like 20 minutes outside of its host. So hepatitis B, which is a more viral virus, can live up to a couple days outside of the host, but it's not going to live for days upon days or weeks upon weeks without having something to basically live in. That would be the host. Bacterias are single-celled organisms that are abundant in our environment, internally and externally. So we have bacteria on our skins, we have bacteria in our body, in our colon, that they just live there, and they're abundant, and most of the time the bacteria do not cause any problem for the individual. When problems do arise with the bacteria, there's usually something else feeding into that. That would be something like an individual that's immunocompromised, or an individual that's already sick or run down or malnourished, or maybe going through chemotherapy and their resistance is down. That's when the bacteria will take over. There are 3 common groups of bacteria, and this is just a review. I'm sure the majority of you have had biology or microbiology, and the groups of bacteria are bacilli, and their shape is rod-shaped. Cocci, which is a round-shaped bacteria, and spirilla, which is spiral-shaped. More disease-causing agents would be rickettsia, which is a small bacteria, very small, almost as small as a virus. They are intercellular parasites, more like a bacteria than a virus, but with one exception. They always are transported by insects or other arthropod vectors. And the example that the book gives is Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which we will talk about when we talk about the different bacteria and infections that different agents cause. We'll talk about Rocky Mountain spotted fever. A fungi or a fungi is a single-celled or multi-celled plant-like organism. Funguses always require air, so they have to breathe. And I would always tell the students one thing to think about when you're trying to determine if it's a fungus or not. It always requires warm, dark, moist. So when you think of athlete's foot, which is a fungus, where athlete's foot presents itself obviously is on the feet, in between the toes. And that's just an absolutely perfect environment for fungus, is warm, dark, moist. And the same would be with vaginal yeast infections, candidiasis, which is a fungus, warm, dark, moist. Thrush, which is candidiasis or a yeast of the mouth, once again, warm, dark, moist. So always kind of associate a fungus with that warm, dark, moist environment, and it needs to breathe. The next is protozoids or protozoa, and those are microscopic single-celled parasitic animals. They like warm tropical temperature and climates. They release toxins and enzymes that destroy cells or interfere with normal cell function. And the example that's used is malaria, which we know malaria comes from definitely tropical climates, and also dysentery, ambient dysentery, which is like the what is it, Montezuma's revenge that people get when they go to Mexico. And that is definitely an intestinal tract disorder that people are really, really sick with when they come home from tropical climates. Metazoa are multicellular parasitic animals. They're basically worms that can be divided into three categories: tapeworms, ringworms, and flukes. They can travel from body part to body part, organ to organ, through the bloodstream. And the example that the book uses is pinworms, which we'll discuss later on. Trichinosis, which is it's a worm that basically is very significantly known for living in pork. You don't see trichinosis like you used to see it due to the way that the pork, the people that raise pork in the new environments and climates that they're in, and also with how the USDA inspects slaughterhouses. Trichinosis actually could be fatal, and also tapeworm, which is another one we will discuss later on. Get with the infectious agent, and one would be through direct contact, and that would be, like I said, mucous membranes. If you would be, kissing somebody that possibly would have a herpetic lesion, that's, you are making direct contact with that individual. Droplet exposure, that would be someone coughing and you breathing in the droplets. Sexual contact, that would be, obviously having unprotected sex with someone maybe that has herpetic, the herpetic virus simplex 2, which is vaginal herpetic lesions, basically genital herpetic lesions. So having sexual contact with that individual puts you at risk as well. And it's the same thing with hepatitis B. It's the same thing with HIV. That's a direct contact with another individual. Indirect would be touching something or ingesting something. And so you obviously wouldn't have any control over if you ate. I'm sure pretty much all of us have had at one time or another food poisoning and maybe not even realized it was food poisoning and thought it was the flu, but you've ingested something that was contaminated. Our reservoirs where the agent likes to live is would be like people, animals, soil. I want to say it's hookworms that live in the soil. Water, we just talked about dysentery. There's when we start really getting into the different infectious agents throughout the book, you'll see how many of them are carried in water, and drinking the contaminated water, obviously, the individual gets sick. The last step in our chain of infection is the portal of exit. So how is that infectious agent actually leaving the host's body? And that would be through respiratory secretions, airborne droplets, that would be feces. We'll see a little bit later on when we start looking at our different infectious agents and what they cause, the feces, the different outbreaks of E. coli that came from feces, blood. We all know that as healthcare providers, blood, saliva, people with runny eyes, scratching their eyes, could be conjunctivitis or pink eye. They're scratching their eye. And touch their desk. That's why when one kid in a classroom has pink eye, pretty much the whole class has pink eye. Also sores. So talking about sores, the one example that comes to mind for me is chicken pox, and I guess herpetic lesions as well. They drain, they ooze, and that drainage contains the agent, and someone touching it can potentially come down with that particular disease. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, I don't have a PowerPoint for it, but just so you are aware of the different stages of disease. They're listed on page 42, and there are 5 different stages of disease. One being the incubation stage, and that's when basically the infectious agent would enter the body, a healthy body. The prodromal stage is symptoms first start, like you just start feeling some symptoms. And with a herpetic lesion, that would be people that get a herpetic lesion will say they always feel like maybe a little numbness, a little tingling in the area, and they know they're going to be getting a herpetic lesion because that's the prodromal stage. They know it's coming on. The same thing with before you actually get sick with the flu, you might start sneezing. You might start with a little runny nose, maybe just a low-grade fever. The next stage, which is stage 3, is the clinical stage, and that's when the disease or infection that you have reaches its peak. Okay, so that's when you're super, super sick with the flu and you've got the temperature and you feel miserable and you're laying in bed and you have no energy and you're achy. That would be your clinical stage, stage 3. And stage 4 is the decline stage, and that would be where your symptoms start to decrease and you start to feel a little bit better. And then within that stage, a lot of times people think they are better, and this disease can reoccur. So that's another consideration I that'll be something we'll discuss later on, why it's so important that you finish your antibiotic, because you feel better does not mean that disease is gone. So you quit taking the antibiotic, and then before you know it, you're sicker than you were in the very beginning. So that stage, which is stage 4, can either go one way or the other. It can go where you do recover 100% or you get sick again. And then the last stage is called the convalescent stage, and that's when you're fully recovered. So just, make sure you read over those 5 stages again and have an understanding of them. That'll be necessary as we progress on and start actually talking about the infectious agents and what they actually cause.